Welcome back to a Tech Moment on Cannabis Tech. I'm your host, Christina Etter. In this podcast, we take just a few minutes each month to talk about some of the exciting science and technology that's happening in the cannabis and hemp industries. And each month now, we have been taking a little bit of time to catch up with RJ Hopp, who's the director of Hemp Markets at PanXchange, to talk about some of the exciting developments that's going on in the hemp market that's provided by PanXchange's monthly Hemp Markets report. Welcome back to the show, RJ.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm glad to be here again.
Absolutely. Of course, it's always so much fun to see that everybody survived another month in 2020, right? It's been such a challenging year for us. Now, speaking about challenges, though, in the hemp markets, I see that some of our hemp farmers in the southern markets are facing some challenges down there. Do you want to talk about what southern blight is and how you feel it might be impacting the hemp market?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at a high level, it's a fungus that affects plants. And it's not unique to hemp. It's something that can impact peppers, tomatoes, a whole slew of different things. But it has cropped up in the hemp market, specifically impacting people in the South. And the two big problems that I see with it is first, there's not necessarily a cure for it. If the fungus is in the soil, it can get picked up from heavy rain, transferred to the leaves, and then unfortunately it'll end up causing the plant to wilt and then die off afterwards. But it is interesting to see that it's a problem that specifically has impacted people in the Southeast, and I think a lot of it has to do with the hot and wet and humid climate that's down there. So there's been a lot of reports that have come out in Louisiana specifically. It's something that impacted farmers in Tennessee and Kentucky last year. But as with all things in agriculture, there's things that go wrong, and the Southeast isn't the only markets that have had some of these impedances this year. Hail has been a bigger thing on the eastern side of Colorado. And then also some people have also had problems with genetics, again, in terms of the germination rate and actually getting things to grow. So people definitely have been successful, but it also is worth pointing out that some people are having troubles, especially as we're all trying to calculate how many acres are going to be planted this year. And that report from the USDA comes out next week to really get a better grasp of that.
Right. And I think that really is kind of an important point to make, is that so often because of, maybe previous reputation or the way things were with hemp, a lot of times people think hemp is just a weed and it's going to grow like crazy no matter what you do. But when you really get down to the details of the crop, this still is a valuable crop that requires, specific conditions. And sometimes Mother Nature does throw a little a wrench in people's plans when it comes to growing outdoor crops like these. So that's really interesting to hear how Mother Nature in different regions, could be impacting some of these crops and some of the farmers as well. Now, one of the other things that I do want to touch base on out of the report that I found really interesting were some of these updates from the FDA. Do you want to talk about some of what you have included there with the FDA reporting and what they're talking about regarding the clinical research with hemp farms?
Yeah, absolutely. So the FDA recently released a document, and the important thing to note there is that it was issued as a guidance. So nothing is set in stone at this point. But I viewed that document as interesting to dive into, because although, as you mentioned, it is very much tailored for the pharmaceutical medical markets. The FDA is also the ones that are reviewing CBD for the inclusion of food products and things along those lines. So their line of thinking, I believe, extends beyond this document. There's a lot of things that were talked about in there, but a couple things really stuck out to me. So the first one, as you mentioned, in terms of research, they loosened up a lot of the regulations in terms of where research institutes could actually source their hemp, whereas before it was all run through the University of Mississippi. Now, if it's compliant hemp, it can be sourced from a broader range, which ultimately I think just breaks down barriers to entry in terms of actually having hemp readily available to study it. So not a huge shift in terms of how much sales are going to go through in the market, but more research is better, especially when we're talking about some of these laws that are coming down in terms of how CBD is regulated. And then the second thing that I thought was interesting is they had a couple lines with regard to intermediary products that actually have increased in THC levels through the processing process, where it could have been legal hemp when it came out of the field, but as the potency is raised on the CBD, the THC also rises. So I see that as a bigger issue going forward in terms of exactly how that's going to be regulated, because there hasn't been a whole lot of guidance. It's all been focused on the plant itself. And the general market has been trying to figure out, all right, well, what exactly does this mean? There's kind of that gray area, so to say. Do want to point out that Kentucky does have that legislation that allows intermediary products to go from processor to processor. If both of them have a license, if it does exceed 0.3%. But the vast majority of the United States is sitting in that scenario of, is this bending the law? So it is an interesting development there.
Definitely. And, I know that argument's been out there now for quite a while. Dr. Sue Sisley has been, kind of leading the charge on opening up availability for research purposes and actively speaking out against having just the one resource for biomass material for research purposes. So it's really interesting to see this included in that FDA statement and see that they're starting to kind of open up that door a little bit to allow some other companies to come in to help provide some of this material that's needed for research. I think that is just absolutely huge. Now, back to that discussion on THC, I've always kind of wondered about this particular cannabinoid in the hemp market. Since, according to the hemp laws, the 0.3% THC in hemp is considered legal, as all cannabinoids in hemp are. But THC is still THC. So I'm really kind of curious about the FDA stance on this, because we know that extraction processes now are going to allow extractors to isolate that cannabinoid and pull it out. And I can't imagine too many producers that are really anxious to throw away such a valuable cannabinoid. So do you want to touch base a little bit on what the FDA says about that THC?
Yeah, I think it is an interesting topic. And a lot of it comes down to that delineation between the, what we call the cannabis market and the hemp market, where cannabis isn't federally legal, but hemp is. So there has to be some sort of a line drawn there. And going forward, I think that having more clarity on these refined products and how much concentration can be in it the entire way through will help out producers, processors, really everybody across the line, as people want to be compliant. The other interesting thing that I forgot to bring up earlier too, that on this topic of THC that I thought was interesting, is that they actually started to outline for the labs how they'd like people to test. So starting to produce some standards there, which in the physical market, lab reliability and having discrepancies between labs has been a big topic. So having a standardization that hopefully a lot of these labs will start to follow will help to have more transparent results, so that you don't have one that's way higher, one that's way lower, which I think, getting back to the transportation issue, being confident in those lab results is going to be huge. So it's interesting to see that the standardization aspect of it is there as well.
Definitely. Yes. Standardization, and especially in the world of testing, I think is going to be so important going forward. But let's shift gears a little bit now. One of the other things that's in the report this month that I absolutely found fascinating was just the talk about Hempcrete, and understanding that there is a little misconception there in a lot of the Hempcrete products that are on the market. So do you want to talk about the considerations of Hempcrete in building materials?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that we took a little bit of a different approach as to our previous industrial sections. But where we're really coming from is I think there is a tendency in the industry to look at what XYZ hemp product can supplant in the market, see how big that entire market is, without taking into account what that'll be used for. So it's no misconception out in the market that concrete is an absolutely gigantic market. I mean, we look at roads, buildings, bridges. Everything has concrete in it. But from my opinion, and I think that we've mentioned this and talked about this previously, in order for a product to make it into a market and have legs, it has to compete at the same specification in terms of how that product will actually perform. So just taking the massive concrete market and saying this is a huge market that hemp can go into, and we can use Hempcrete, I think is a little bit of a misnomer. So in my opinion, I don't think that we're going to see roads at this point made out of Hempcrete, but absolutely don't want to take anything away from the properties that have shown a lot of value in terms of using it for insulation, for one example. So I think that the Hempcrete market absolutely has legs, but it ultimately comes down to the structural soundness of it. And we can have bridges collapse because we use a new product. So that's more or less what we went into, which I thought was an important point to make when we're looking at these different markets and dissecting how big of an industrial market each one of these can actually have.
Right. And that's a lot of times too for people that maybe aren't part of the construction industry, or aren't aware of a lot of the standards and limitations or requirements, I guess, for building particular structures or things like that. There are load bearing requirements, and so it's interesting to put all of that into perspective when talking about hempcrete and hemp building materials. So very interesting report this month, RJ. And the last thing I really want you to do is tell our audience where they can go and find this full report if they want to dig into the information further, and how they can subscribe so they can get this delivered to their inbox every month.
Yeah, absolutely. So I direct everybody to www.PanXchange.com. Our website's segmented out so you can go and just see what we have in terms of hemp, and then we also have a couple other live markets. The other thing I do want to recommend is if anybody has individual questions, wants to reach out and talk to us about anything before, we can be easily reached at hemp@panexchange.com. So if anybody has any questions, reach out. There's also the information on the website as well.
Fantastic, RJ. Well, again, we appreciate you coming on every month and talking to us about these changes and some of the new findings that are happening in the hemp market. So definitely appreciate your time today, and thank you very much for being on the show.
Absolutely. It was great as always.